from Ole Miss today. It's never been a more exciting time to be an Ole Miss fan. They just had their best season last year ever, and it looks like they're going to have their next best season ever this year. Probably going to be even better than they were last year. And this will be the best roster that they've ever had this year. Uh, so uh, I will first be going through the roster, and then I'll go through their schedule game by game and give you a predicted winner and loser for each game. But starting at quarterback, Jackson Dart really improved as a quarterback from year one to year two at Ole Miss, and he's actually become a very good quarterback. He wasn't that very good at throwing the deep ball in his first year at Ole Miss, but he really got good at the deep ball last year. He'll be one of the top quarterbacks in the country this year. I think he'll be the second best quarterback in the SEC this year. And he averaged 258 passing yards a game last year, and he can also run around too. So they're in very good shape at quarterback. And then at wide receiver, they returned two of three starters from last season. Of course, I've talked about Trey Harris. He might win the wide receiver of the year award this year. He's at least a top five wide receiver. He's the type of wide receiver that any NFL team would want to have. He's able to make some really tough catches. And I think he will probably be a first round pick next season. Uh, and the other returning starter, Jordan Watkins, is really good too. He had 53 catches for 741 yards and three touchdowns, averaging 14 yards a catch last season. And he's even better than you would think hearing those numbers because he got hurt in the sixth game last season and never really was the same after that. But in the first six games last season, he had 36 catches for 536 and averaged 14.9 yards per catch and had three games of over 100 receiving yards. And the starter they lose, Dayton Wade, was good for them last year, but I actually think they've upgraded from him, bringing in Juice Wells from South Carolina, who I've talked about before. And he was hurt most of last season's, but in 2022 he was one of the best receivers in the SEC. With the starters, at wide receiver, Ole Miss is in really good shape. And at tight end, Caden Prieskorn transferred in from Memphis last year and really came on late in the year. And I think he's going to be at least a top three tight end this year. So they're in really good shape there, too. And then at running back, of course, I do hate to lose Judkins. He might be the second best running back in the country. But they return his backup from last season, Ulysses Bentley, who is also really good, and he would have been the starting running back on most teams last season. He's very speedy, like Judkins is, but he's not quite as good at breaking tackles as Judkins. But he had last season on just 95 carries, at 540 yards. And four touchdowns, averaging 5.7 yards a carry. I think he'll be a 1,000 yard rusher this year. And then they bring in from LSU a really good running back, Logan Diggs, who last season had 653 yards on 119 carries, averaging 5.5 yards a carry, and had seven touchdown runs. I think he'll be the number two running back. And then they bring in a transfer running back from a little team, Miami, Ohio, but he had there last season 1,075 yards and 13 touchdowns, averaging 5.1 yards a carry. And an interesting thing about this is he was at first going to play football this year for the Coach Prime Colorado Clown Show. But in the spring, he switched his transfer over to Ole Miss because I'm sure he saw that Colorado is going to have a terrible team again, and that Coach Prime is a fake coach that has no idea what he's doing. So he decided he wanted to go somewhere where he'll have a real coach and uh, is going to have a good team this year. So he decided to go to Ole Miss, which makes sense with that. Uh, mm, and they also bring in a transfer from Miami, Henry Parrish, who actually started his college career at Ole Miss and has spent the last 2 years at Miami and is coming back for his final season. He has on 392 carries in his college career, 2,058 yards and 15 touchdowns, averaging 5.3 yards per carry. So they are loaded at the running back position. Uh, and on the offensive line, so this has been the weakness with Ole Miss's offense, coached by Lane Kiffin. They've always had with him a good quarterback and good running backs and receivers, but they have never had a good offensive line, and it's held back their offense from being elite. And I think he's fixed that this year, bringing in three really good transfers. And they also have three starters coming back. Their offensive line really struggled at the beginning of last season, but that shouldn't be the case this year. They bring in two really good offensive linemen from Washington, and they won the award for the best offensive line in the country last year. They bring in Nate Calipo, who last year only allowed one sack and 16 pressures, and then uh, Julius Below, uh, who's also from Washington. And I couldn't find his numbers, but he was a starter on that line last year, so I know he's really good. Uh, and then they bring in a, a transfer offensive lineman from North Carolina, Diego Pounds, who is really good. Only allowed one sack and 21 pressures there last year. So they should actually have a good offensive line this year. And that is important when you go against a really good team like Georgia or Alabama. And then on the defensive side, this will be the best defensive line that I think Ole Miss has ever had. They returned two really good defensive linemen, J.J. Begeese, who had 42 tackles, 3.5 sacks, three pass breakups, and six total pressures last year. And then Jared Ivey, who had 46 tackles, 5.5 sacks, two fumble recoveries, two pass breakups, and 10 total pressures at last season. And then they bring in two really good defensive linemen. They bring in a really good pass rusher from Florida, Princely Amon Maline, who had 39 tackles there last season and 7 sacks, and he had 45 total pressures, which is a whole lot. He's really going to help them with the pass rush, I think. And then also Walter Nolan from Texas A&M, who in 22 games and 14 starts there had 66 tackles, 5 sacks, and 29 total pressures. So he can help them with the pass rush too. And at linebacker, this is the weakest part, I think, of Ole Miss's defense this year. But I still think they'll be solid at linebacker. They do have Chris Paul coming in from Arkansas who will help them out. Who in 25 games and 14 starts has 136 tackles, six sacks and 29 total pressures. And they have a five-star linebacker who didn't start last year but will start this year, I'm pretty sure. Sonterrain Perkins, who had 38 tackles and 3.5 sacks last year, but they're just not really deep at linebacker. I think Ole Miss will have a good defense though this year, and I think they will run the 4-2-5 a lot this year with only like two really good linebackers, and they've got so much talent in the secondary that I'm going to talk about right now. So at safety, they are loaded. They have two starters returning. John Saunders, who had 65 tackles, four pass breakups, and three interceptions last season, and then Trey Washington, who had 83 tackles, three interceptions, and two pass breakups, and a forced fumble and fumble recovery last year. And then they bring in three really good transfer safeties. They bring in Key Lawrence from Oklahoma, who in 36 games and 14 starts had 148 tackles, six forced fumbles, 10 pass breakups, and three interceptions. And they bring in Lewis Moore from Indiana, who had 83 tackles and three interceptions and three forced fumbles and a pick six last season. And they bring in Yam Banks from South Alabama, who is a 3 year starter at safety. And in those 3 years combined, has 144 tackles, 2.5 sacks, seven interceptions, 16 pass breakups, three forced fumbles, and two fumble recoveries. And then I think they're going to be better at the cornerback position this year, too. They brought in two good cornerback transfers. They brought in Isaiah Hamilton from Houston, who had 50 tackles, four interceptions, four pass breakups, a forced fumble, and a pick six last season. Uh, and they bring in Trey Amos from Alabama, who wasn't a starter last year, but did play in every game. He had 12 tackles and five pass breakups last season, and he did a nice job filling in for Kool-Aid McKinstry when he got hurt in the SEC championship game. Uh, and then on special teams, they get both specialists back, so they should be solid on special teams this year. And Now it's time for the predictions. They start the year against Fireman, which will be a very easy win. They'll probably score 70 points in that game, and they may shut out Fireman. And then they play Middle Tennessee, which will also be a very easy win, a huge blowout. And Then they play Wake Forest, and this will be an easy win. They'll beat Wake, no problem. I think this will be like a 42-0 type of game. And then they play Georgia Southern, which will also be a big blowout win. Uh, so now they start their conference schedule against Kentucky. So I do think this will be a close game. Kentucky is going to be well coached. Mark Stoops knows what he's doing as a football coach, and he always has uh, good lines of scrimmage. Uh, and I do, though, think that Ole Miss is just a much better team than Kentucky is. Though. I do think they'll win this game by around a touchdown. And then They play on the road at South Carolina. So I know about how South Carolina can be a tough place to play, but I don't do my predictions where I just pick the home team pretty much every time. If I think a team is quite a bit better than the other, I pick them no matter where it's going to be played, and that's the case with this one. Ole Miss is so much better than South Carolina. South Carolina wasted Spencer Rattler last year, who was a good quarterback with a horrible offensive line that gave up over 40 sacks and got pushed around by everybody they played against. And I think their line of scrimmage will be bad this year. And Ole Miss is going to have a much better group of wide receivers and a much better quarterback than South Carolina is going to have. And they're going to be better, I think, than South Carolina everywhere this year. I think that Ole Miss wins this game fairly easily, probably by like 17 points. And then they play LSU on the road, so I know LSU is a very tough place to play. But for the first time in uh, probably a very long time, Ole Miss actually has a better roster than LSU does. They have a better quarterback, I think, and they've got a much better running back unit and better wide receivers. And now LSU may have a little bit of an advantage on the offensive line over Ole Miss, but Ole Miss has a huge advantage over them on the defensive line. And LSU may have a little bit of an advantage at linebacker, but then Ole Miss has an advantage in the secondary over them. And LSU's defense, I think, will be able to be more average this year, but I'm not convinced that it's going to be uh, good this year. And Ole Miss beat them last year with Jaden Daniels, who wasn't just an elite quarterback, but also uh, their best rusher. And now Ole Miss also has LSU's best running back, Logan Diggs, on their team. And Ole Miss is going to have a better offense, I think, than LSU this year, and their defense was already better than LSU's last year, and I think it's going to be improved this year. Uh, so I do think this game will be really close, and I could see it going either way, but I'm going with Ole Miss. Well, Ole Miss hasn't won at LSU in over 15 years. Yeah, I know that, but Ole Miss hadn't beat Auburn 2 years in a row in 70 years until last season. So just because they haven't won at LSU in over 15 years doesn't mean they can't win at LSU now. Things can change. Uh, and then they play Oklahoma after getting a week off, and I think the week off will help them after a tough game against LSU. Ole Miss, I think, has an advantage at quarterback in this game, and uh, wide receiver is probably pretty close to even, but I think Ole Miss has a better offensive line and running back unit, and defensively. Oklahoma, though, does match up pretty well with Ole Miss, but I think that Ole Miss just has more offense this year than Oklahoma does, and I do think it'll be close, but I think Ole Miss wins this one by around a touchdown. Uh, and then they play on the road at Arkansas. So this game could be closer than you would think, coming off a tough game against Oklahoma, and then now going on the road against a team that is bad but is not terrible. Ole Miss may not be playing at their ceiling in this game because when you compare rosters between Ole Miss and Arkansas, Ole Miss should blow them out. But they may get off to a slow start in this game, but they're the better team, and I do think that they'll pull away late and win this game by around 2 touchdowns. Now I know Ole Miss hasn't won in Fayetteville, Arkansas, in over 15 years, but I think that that changes this year. Uh, and then they play Georgia at home, so that is a big help getting that game at home this year. And uh, mm, Ole Miss had terrible play calling in that game last year. They didn't even try to blitz, and they kept calling runs up the middle on Georgia, and you know that's not going to work. The Ole Miss just didn't have that good of a pass rush anyway last year. But I think with the defensive line transfers they brought in, that will help get pressure on Carson Beck. And I think the transfers in the secondary will help them be able to cover Beck and those wide receivers much better than last year. And I think Ole Miss will score more than last year against Georgia with the improved offensive line. They can match Georgia now better at the line of scrimmage than they were able to last year. And I think both teams will score in the 30s in this game. But I'm going with Ole Miss to get the upset. And then they play on the road at Florida. Florida is not going to be very good. Their coach has no idea what he's doing. He probably won't even be coaching in this game because he'll be fired. I do think that Ole Miss wins this game by a couple of touchdowns, even though Florida is a pretty tough place to play. They're just a much better team than Florida this year. And Ole Miss has Florida's best pass rusher anyway. And then it's comes time for the Egg Bowl. This game is going to be played on Friday after Thanksgiving this year. So that's something that Mississippi State can be thankful for this Thanksgiving, that they won't have to lose to Ole Miss on Thanksgiving. And Ole Miss, doesn't get to play Vanderbilt every year anymore, but getting to play Mississippi State should help make up for that because they're going to be close to Vanderbilt this year. This is the biggest difference, I think, that Ole Miss and Mississippi State's football teams have ever had. Ole Miss is going to be so much better, and they should destroy Mississippi State if you compare rosters. But I do think that the rivalry will keep this game somewhat competitive. But I do think that Ole Miss does win this time by around 2 touchdowns. So my final prediction for Ole Miss is 12-0 overall and 8-0 in the conference. So that would for sure put them in the SEC championship. Probably in a rematch against Georgia if my Georgia predictions come true. And if you're getting ideas of telling me in the comments that because I'm an Ole Miss fan, I would say this in a year. Believe it or not, this isn't just the first time I thought Ole Miss would go 12-0. It's the first time I thought they had any chance to go 12-0. So if you're wanting to do that, go cry about something else. But that will be it with this video. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and hotty toddy.